Sometimes the most powerful miracles happen in the most humble places. When billionaire shipping heiress Aurora Wyndham steps into a rundown community rehab center, she expects nothing more than another disappointing therapy session for her daughter Isla, who lost both legs in a childhood accident. Instead, she discovers Evan Cole, a grease-stained auto mechanic who spends his evenings crafting custom prosthetic legs from salvaged car parts and medical supplies, using the same steady hands that rebuild engines to rebuild children's dreams of walking again. Evan learned these skills while creating lightweight prosthetics for his own 6-year-old son Max, turning their garage workshop into a place where metal and hope merge into something beautiful. What Aurora witnesses over the following weeks will shatter every assumption she's held about class, worth, and the true meaning of innovation. When Isla takes her first steps on Evan's handcrafted prosthetics, crossing that worn gymnasium floor and collapsing into her mother's arms with tears of joy streaming down both their faces, Aurora realizes she's been searching for something that can't be manufactured in sterile labs or purchased with endless resources. But will Aurora's life-changing offer to transform Evan's humble workshop create the fairy tale ending they all deserve? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The alarm clock's shrill cry pierced through the darkness at 5:30 a.m., dragging Evan Cole from the few precious hours of sleep he managed to steal between shifts. His calloused hands fumbled for the snooze button, careful not to wake Max, who lay curled beneath dinosaur-printed sheets in the narrow bed they shared in their cramped apartment. The morning routine had become second nature over the past 3 years, a carefully orchestrated dance of survival that left no room for self-pity or hesitation. Evan's toolbox sat by the door, its red metal surface scarred from years of honest work. Inside, nestled between socket wrenches and screwdrivers, lay the delicate instruments of his other calling: precision files, medical-grade aluminum pieces, and tiny bolts that most people would mistake for jewelry hardware. This duality defined his existence. By day, he coaxed life back into broken engines. By night, he performed the same miracle on broken dreams. The bathroom mirror reflected a man who looked older than his 32 years. Deep lines etched around his green eyes spoke of countless nights spent bent over workbenches, squinting at blueprints by the light of a single desk lamp. His brown hair, perpetually tousled despite his best efforts, or traces of motor oil that never quite washed out. But those same hands that emerged from engine blocks covered in grease could thread the smallest screw into a child's prosthetic joint with the precision of a surgeon. Max stirred as Evan pulled on his coveralls, the familiar rustling sound part of their morning symphony. The boy's left foot, encased in a custom-built prosthetic that looked more like a work of art than a medical device, peeked out from under the covers. Evan had spent months perfecting that foot, learning through trial and error, YouTube videos, and countless conversations with the one orthopedic specialist who'd taken pity on a desperate father working 3 jobs to pay for his son's surgery. "Morning, buddy," Evan whispered, sitting on the edge of the bed. Max's eyes opened slowly, still heavy with sleep, but they sparkled with the resilience that never ceased to amaze his father. At 6 years old, Max had already endured more challenges than most adults, yet he approached each day with an enthusiasm that put Evan's occasional self-doubt to shame. "Is today workshop day?" Max asked, his voice still thick with sleep. Even at his young age, he understood the rhythm of their lives. The days when Daddy worked on cars belonged to other people, but the evenings when they worked together in their makeshift garage laboratory belonged to them. "Tonight, we're helping Sarah with her new knee joint," Evan confirmed, watching his son's face light up. Max had appointed himself assistant engineer for all of Evan's prosthetic projects, taking his role with the seriousness of someone who understood that their work meant the difference between walking and watching from the sidelines. 40 miles across town, Aurora Wyndham stood in her marble-floored kitchen, staring at the untouched breakfast her housekeeper had prepared. The morning light filtered through floor-to-ceiling windows, casting geometric shadows across the pristine, white surfaces that had never known the chaos of a family meal. Her diamond wedding ring caught the light as she lifted her coffee, cup a reminder of the life she'd built with Jonathan before cancer claimed him 2 years ago, leaving her to navigate single motherhood with a fortune that felt more like a burden than a blessing. Isla sat at the far end of the dining table, her wheelchair positioned at an angle that allowed her to reach her plate without assistance. At 9 years old, she possessed an intelligence that sometimes unnerved Aurora, as if her daughter could see through the careful facade of normalcy that Aurora worked so hard to maintain. The accident that had claimed Isla's legs at age 4 had also stolen something from Aurora, a confidence in her ability to protect the people she loved most. Dr. Martinez called yesterday, Aurora said carefully, watching her daughter's reaction. He wants to try a new therapy center. It's different from the others. Isla's fork paused midway to her mouth. They'd been through this routine before: the phone calls, the consultations, the carefully managed expectations that inevitably led to disappointment. The best medical facilities money could buy had become a parade of sterile rooms and well-meaning professionals who spoke in clinical terms about realistic goals and managing expectations. Different how? Isla asked, her voice carrying the weary wisdom of someone who'd learned to protect herself from hope. Aurora hesitated. The community rehabilitation center Dr. Martinez had mentioned was nothing like the pristine facilities they'd visited before. Located in a converted warehouse in a neighborhood Aurora's driver usually avoided, it served families who couldn't afford the private clinics that had become their second home. The thought of taking Isla there felt like admitting defeat, acknowledging that their wealth and connections had failed to provide what their daughter needed most. It's smaller, Aurora said finally, more personal. They have volunteers who work with the children, people who understand what it's like to face these challenges. The truth was more complicated. Dr. Martinez had been hesitant to recommend the center, concerned about the contrast between Aurora's expectations and the facility's resources. But something in his voice, when he'd mentioned a mechanic who'd revolutionized prosthetic design for his own son, had planted a seed of curiosity in Aurora's mind. That evening, Evan's garage came alive with the controlled chaos of creation. Max sat cross-legged on a foam cushion, sorting tiny screws into labeled containers, while Evan worked on Sarah's knee joint. The 13-year-old had been born with a condition that required multiple surgeries, and her family's insurance had long since reached its limits. Evan's workshop had become her lifeline, a place where innovation mattered more than insurance codes. The garage smelled of metal shavings and the faint scent of the coffee that fueled Evan's late-night sessions. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows that softened around the edges where Christmas lights Max had strung up last December still twinkled. Tools hung from pegboards with the precision of a surgeon's operating room, each one serving a specific purpose in the delicate art of mechanical rehabilitation. "Tell me about the spring tension again," Max said, his small fingers tracing the mechanism Evan had designed to mimic the natural bounce of a healthy knee. These were the moments Evan treasured most, when his son's curiosity transformed their shared challenge into an adventure in problem-solving. "It's like a trampoline," Evan explained, his voice taking on the patient tone he reserved for teaching moments. "Too tight, and it doesn't give when Sarah walks. Too loose, and it won't support her weight. We're looking for that perfect balance, where it feels natural." As they worked, Evan's phone buzzed with a text from his supervisor at the auto shop. Another overtime shift was available, and the extra money would help cover Max's upcoming checkup. But looking at his son's concentrated face, watching him learn the skills that might someday help other children, Evan knew that some things were worth more than the additional hours on his paycheck. Across town, Aurora stood in her late husband's study, surrounded by medical journals and research papers she'd been collecting for months. The mahogany desk was covered with printouts of prosthetic designs, testimonials from families who'd found hope in unexpected places, and a growing pile of business cards from specialists who'd promised miracles, but delivered only marginal improvements. The leather chair where Jonathan used to sit felt empty, haunted by memories of the man who'd taught her that true wealth came from the impact you made on others' lives. His shipping empire had been built on the principle that everyone deserved access to opportunity, regardless of their circumstances. Aurora wondered what he would think of her hesitation to take Isla to a community center, her fear of stepping outside the comfortable bubble of privilege that had defined their lives. A soft knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Isla appeared. In the doorway, her wheelchair navigating the thick carpet with practiced ease. "Mom, are you okay?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with the weight of all the conversations they'd never had about hope and disappointment, about the difference between surviving and truly living. Aurora looked at her daughter, this brave, brilliant girl who'd faced every challenge with more grace than Aurora had ever managed, and felt the familiar tightness in her chest that came with the recognition of her own inadequacy. "I'm fine, sweetheart," Aurora said, the lie coming easily after years of practice. "Just doing some research." Isla rolled closer, her eyes scanning the papers scattered across the desk. "About the new place?" Aurora nodded, unable to find words that wouldn't sound like another empty promise. The community center represented everything she'd been taught to avoid: uncertainty, lack of control, the possibility of failure. But it also represented something else, something that had been missing from all their previous attempts. The kind of innovation that came from necessity rather than funding, from love rather than profit margins. "Can we try it?" Isla asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Just once?" The question cut through Aurora's carefully constructed defenses, revealing the truth she'd been avoiding. Despite all their resources, all the experts they'd consulted, all the state-of-the-art facilities they'd visited, Isla was still watching from the sidelines while other children ran and played and lived their lives without thinking about the mechanics of movement. "Yes," Aurora said, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. "We can try it." As Isla smiled, the first genuine smile Aurora had seen in months, she felt something shift inside her chest. It might have been hope, or it might have been the beginning of the kind of courage that her daughter had been showing her all along. Either way, it felt like the first step toward something that had been missing from their lives, the possibility of genuine transformation. The Riverside Community Rehabilitation Center occupied a converted warehouse in a part of town that Aurora's GPS seemed reluctant to navigate. As their black sedan pulled up to the curb, Aurora felt her chest tighten with the familiar anxiety that accompanied stepping outside her carefully controlled environment. The building's brick facade showed its age, with painted-over graffiti and windows that had been replaced with mismatched panes over the years. "This is it?" Isla asked from beside her, craning her neck to see through the tinted windows. Aurora's driver, Robert, cleared his throat diplomatically. "Ma'am, shall I wait here or circle the block?" "Wait here," Aurora said, though part of her wanted to tell him to drive them home immediately. She'd spent the previous night researching the facility online, finding only a basic website with blurry photos and testimonials that seemed too good to be true. Everything about this felt wrong, from the lack of marble lobbies to the absence of valet parking. The entrance was marked by a hand-painted sign that read, "Everyone deserves to move forward," in cheerful blue letters. A small ramp led to glass, doors that had seen better days, their surface covered with children's handprints and colorful stickers. Aurora helped Isla from the car to her wheelchair, noting how the sidewalk's uneven pavement made navigation more challenging than the smooth surfaces they were accustomed to. Inside, The reception area defied Aurora's expectations in ways both troubling and oddly reassuring. The space bustled with activity children of various ages, working with therapists on colorful exercise mats, parents chatting on mismatched chairs that had obviously been donated, and the sound of laughter echoing from deeper within the building. The walls were covered with photos of smiling children, hand-drawn pictures, and certificates of appreciation from grateful families. Mrs. Wyndham? A woman in her 50s approached them, her scrubs decorated with cartoon animals and her smile genuine despite the tired lines around her eyes. I'm Linda, the intake coordinator. Dr. Martinez told me you'd be visiting today. Aurora stood straighter, falling into the polished demeanor that had served her well in boardrooms and charity galas. Yes, we're interested in learning about your programs for Isla. Linda knelt to Isla's eye level, her approach refreshingly direct. And what would you like to know about our programs, Isla? Before Isla could answer, a mechanical grinding sound filled the air, followed by a frustrated sigh from across the room. Aurora turned to see a boy about Max's age sitting beside a wheelchair that had clearly seen better days. One of the wheels had locked up, leaving him stranded in the middle of the therapy area while his mother searched frantically through a purse that looked like it contained her entire life. The repair shop said it would last another month, the woman was saying to Linda, her voice carrying the weight of financial calculations Aurora had never had to make. I don't know what we're going to do. Aurora watched as several staff members gathered around the broken wheelchair, their expressions mixing concern with the practiced resignation of people who dealt with failing equipment before. The boy sat quietly, his hands folded in his lap, and Aurora recognized something in his stillness that reminded her of Isla, the learned patience of children who'd grown accustomed to disappointment. That's when she heard the voice from the doorway. Mind if I take a look? Aurora turned to see a man in oil-stained coveralls entering the reception area, a red toolbox in one hand and a coffee cup in the other. His brown hair was slightly disheveled, and his work boots left faint marks on the linoleum floor. Everything about his appearance screamed working class, from the permanent grease stains under his fingernails to the way he moved with the efficient purpose of someone who solved problems. For a living, Evan, Linda said with obvious relief. I was hoping you'd get here early. The man Evan set down his coffee and toolbox, kneeling beside the wheelchair with the casual confidence of someone who'd seen this problem before. Aurora found herself studying his hands as he examined the mechanism, noting the contradiction between their rough appearance and the delicate way he handled the chair's components. Looks like the bearing seized up, he said to the boy's mother, his voice carrying none of the condescension Aurora had learned to expect from repair technicians. Probably needs cleaning and some new lubricant. I've got parts in my truck that should work. How much will that cost? The woman asked, and Aurora heard the familiar tension of someone calculating expenses they couldn't afford. Evan glanced up at her with a smile that transformed his entire face. Nothing. These old chairs just need some love. Give me 10 minutes. Aurora watched in fascination as he opened his toolbox, revealing an interior that looked nothing like what she'd expected. While one side contained conventional automotive tools, the other held what appeared to be medical equipment precision instruments, small electronic components, and pieces of metal that had been machined to tolerances that seemed impossible for a garage workshop. As Evan worked, a small crowd gathered around him. Children pressed close, their questions coming in rapid succession. How does that work? Can you teach me? Is that going to make it go faster? He answered each one with the patient attention of someone who understood that curiosity was the first step toward learning. Are you a doctor? Isla asked from beside Aurora, her voice carrying the same fascination that Aurora was fighting to hide. Evan looked up from the wheelchair, his eyes meeting Isla's with direct honesty. No, I'm a mechanic. But sometimes the same principles that fix cars can help fix other things too. He reached into his toolbox and pulled out what looked like a miniature shock absorber, no bigger than Aurora's thumb. See this? It's designed to absorb impact in a car's suspension. But if you modify it slightly, he made a quick adjustment with a tiny wrench. It can help a wheelchair handle bumps and rough surfaces better. Aurora found herself leaning forward despite her reservations. You modified automotive parts for medical use? Sometimes the best solutions come from thinking outside the box, Evan replied, his attention returning to the wheelchair. The auto industry has spent billions perfecting mechanisms for movement and impact absorption. No reason that innovation can't help people too. The wheel began turning smoothly under his ministrations, and the boy's face lit up with an expression. Aurora recognized the same look Isla got when something she'd assumed was impossible suddenly became possible. Evan stood and wiped his hands on a rag, refusing the $20 bill the boy's mother tried to press into his palm. Just pay it forward, he said simply. Help someone else when you can. As the family rolled away, the mother calling out gratitude over her shoulder, Aurora felt something shift in her understanding of this place. The center might lack the polished surfaces and corporate efficiency she was accustomed to, but it possessed something else, a sense of community and innovation born from necessity rather than abundance. That's our secret weapon, Linda said quietly to Aurora, watching as Evan cleaned his tools. He volunteers here 3 evenings a week, and I've never seen him meet a problem he couldn't solve. What's his background? Aurora asked, trying to sound casual despite her growing curiosity. Single father, works at Murphy's Auto on the South Side. His son Max had some challenges early on, and Evan learned everything he could about adaptive engineering to help him. Now he shares that knowledge with our families. Aurora studied Evan as he repacked his toolbox, noting the careful way he organized each tool. The practiced efficiency of someone who understood that preparation was the difference between success and frustration. When he approached their group, she felt her usual defensive politeness kick in. Mrs. Wyndham, this is Evan Cole, Linda said. Evan, this is Aurora and her daughter Isla. They're considering our program. Evan extended his hand, and Aurora found herself shaking hands that were warm and calloused and completely honest in a way that made her own. Manicured appearance feel artificial. What brings you to our corner of the world? He asked, and there was no judgment in the question, only genuine interest. We're looking for alternatives, Aurora said carefully. Traditional therapy hasn't provided the results we'd hoped for. Evan's eyes shifted to Isla, taking in her wheelchair and the way she held herself with guarded hope. What kind of challenges are we talking about? Aurora hesitated, unused to discussing Isla's condition with strangers, especially ones who lacked medical credentials. But something in Evan's manner, the same patient attention he'd given the other children, encouraged honesty. Bilateral leg amputation, she said quietly, below the knee. We've tried several prosthetic solutions, but nothing has felt right for her. Evan nodded thoughtfully, his expression shifting into what Aurora would later recognize as his problem-solving mode. Mind if I ask what hasn't worked? Sometimes understanding the failures helps point toward better solutions. For the next 20 minutes, Aurora found herself in the most detailed conversation about Isla's condition that she'd had with anyone outside of medical professionals. Evan asked questions that demonstrated both technical knowledge and an intuitive understanding of the emotional aspects of adaptation. He spoke about weight distribution and joint mechanics with the same ease that he discussed the psychological importance of prosthetics that felt like natural extensions of the body rather than medical appliances. The thing is, Evan said, sitting on his heels so he was at Isla's eye level, most prosthetics are designed by engineers who've never had to use them. They're technically perfect, but they don't account for how it feels to be 9 years old and just want to run around like everyone else. Isla's eyes widened slightly. You've made prosthetics for kids? My son and a few others here at the center. Each one is different because each person is different. It's not about creating a standard solution. It's about creating the right solution for you. Aurora felt her carefully maintained skepticism beginning to crack. Everything about this conversation challenged her assumptions about expertise and credentials and the kind of innovation that money could buy. Evan spoke about engineering principles with the casual fluency of someone who'd learned through necessity rather than textbooks, and his focus on Isla's individual needs felt revolutionary after months of doctors who treated her condition as a standard medical problem. Would you like to see my workshop? Evan asked, glancing between Aurora and Isla. It's nothing fancy, but I've got some prototypes that might interest you. Aurora's instinct was to decline, to retreat to the familiar safety of scheduled appointments and official consultations. But Isla's quick yes please overrode her hesitation, and she found herself following Evan deeper into the building, into a world that would challenge everything she thought she knew about innovation, class, and the true meaning of expertise. 3 days later, Aurora found herself returning to the community center with an emotion she couldn't quite name, something between anticipation and terror that kept her awake the previous night. A decision to let Isla try Evan's Unconventional approach had come after hours of internal debate, phone calls to Dr. Martinez for reassurance, and a conversation with Isla that revealed how desperately her daughter wanted to believe in the possibility of walking again. Evan's workshop occupied a corner of the building that had clearly been repurposed from storage space. The concrete floor bore stains from decades of industrial use, and the fluorescent lighting cast harsh shadows that somehow felt more honest than the carefully designed ambiance of the medical facilities they visited. What struck Aurora most was the sense of active creation. Half-finished projects covered workbenches, technical drawings covered the walls, and the air hummed with the energy of problems being solved in real time. Welcome to organized chaos, Evan said, clearing a space on one of the workbenches. Fair warning, it gets a little loud in here. As if summoned by his words, Max appeared from behind a partition, carrying what looked like a miniature leg made from aluminum and carbon fiber. Aurora's breath caught as she realized she was looking at his first prosthetic, the crude but lovingly crafted prototype that had launched Evan's journey into adaptive engineering. Dad, can I show her the cool part? Max asked, his excitement infectious as he approached Isla's wheelchair. Go ahead, buddy. You explain it better than I do anyway. Aurora watched as Max demonstrated the prosthetics features with the enthusiasm of someone showing off a favorite toy. The foot portion had been designed to flex and respond to different surfaces, while the attachment mechanism showed evidence of multiple modifications and improvements. See, it used to hurt when I walked on rocks or stuff, Max explained to Isla, his 6-year-old voice carrying hard-won wisdom. But Dad figured out how to make it bouncy, like a basketball. Now I can run and jump and everything. The casual way Max discussed his prosthetic as a cool piece of technology, rather than a medical necessity, struck Aurora as profoundly different from the clinical atmosphere they'd grown accustomed to. Here, adaptation was presented as innovation, rather than limitation, as problem-solving rather than coping. How long did it take to develop? Aurora asked, studying the craftsmanship that was evident even in this early prototype. About 8 months from start to finish, Evan replied, his hands automatically organizing tools as he spoke. Lots of trial and error, probably too many late nights, and more YouTube videos than I care to admit. But Max was patient with me while I figured things out. It was like a puzzle, Max added. Every time something didn't work right, we'd figure out why and try something different. Dad says that's how you learn stuff, by breaking things first. Aurora found herself studying Evan's face as he interacted with his son, noting the easy affection and mutual respect that characterized their relationship. Max clearly understood the technical aspects of his father's work, asking questions that demonstrated both curiosity and genuine comprehension. This wasn't the typical dynamic between parent and child that Aurora was familiar with. It was more like a partnership between teacher and eager student. "Would you like to see what I'm thinking for Isla?" Evan asked, pulling out a notebook filled with sketches and measurements. "I've been doing some research based on what you told me about her previous experiences." The drawings revealed a level of technical sophistication that challenged Aurora's assumptions about garage workshop engineering. Evan had clearly spent considerable time studying the biomechanics of walking, creating detailed diagrams that showed how weight distribution and joint angles affected comfort and functionality. More importantly, his notes included observations about the psychological aspects of prosthetic use, comments about confidence, self-image, and the importance of devices that felt like natural extensions of the body. Most commercial prosthetics are designed for adults and then scaled down for children, Evan explained, his finger tracing technical details on the page. But kids don't move like small adults. They're more dynamic, more willing to push boundaries, and they need equipment that can keep up with their natural energy. Isla leaned forward in her wheelchair, studying the drawings with intense concentration. "These look different from the ones I tried before." "That's because they're designed specifically for you," Evan said. "Your height, your activity level, your goals. Not a one-size-fits-all solution, but something that works with how you want to move through the world." Aurora felt a familiar tightness in her chest as she watched her daughter's face light up with possibility. They'd been through this cycle before: hope followed by disappointment, progress followed by setbacks. But something about Evan's approach felt different, more grounded in understanding Isla as an individual, rather than treating her as a medical case to be managed. "How long would something like this take to build?" Aurora asked, trying to manage her own expectations as much as Isla's. "If we're doing it right, probably 6 to 8 weeks, Ellen replied. "That includes time for fittings, adjustments, and teaching Isla how to get the most out of them. This isn't something you just strap on and walk away with. It's a process of adaptation and learning." The word "we" hung in the air between them, carrying implications that Aurora wasn't sure she was ready to explore. The idea of becoming genuinely involved in the creation process, of spending weeks in this workshop learning alongside her daughter, felt both thrilling and terrifying. What would that process look like? She found herself asking. Evan's response revealed the depth of thought he'd put into not just the technical aspects of prosthetic design, but the human elements as well. He spoke about the importance of Isla being involved in every step of creation, of understanding how her prosthetics worked so she could troubleshoot problems and make minor adjustments herself. He described a collaborative approach where Isla's feedback would drive design modifications, where her comfort and confidence mattered as much as technical specifications. "The goal isn't just to help her walk," Evan said, his voice carrying quiet conviction. "It's to help her feel like walking is something she owns, something that belongs to her, rather than something that's been done to her." Aurora found herself nodding despite her reservations. Months of medical appointments had left Isla feeling like a passive recipient of treatment, rather than an active participant in her own recovery. The prospect of her daughter becoming a co-creator, rather than just a patient, represented a fundamental shift in how they approached her condition. "Can we start with measurements?" Isla asked, her voice carrying a hope that Aurora recognized as both precious and fragile. Evan's smile was answer enough, but he spoke anyway. "Absolutely. That's the fun part, figuring out exactly what we're working with." For the next hour, Aurora watched as Evan conducted the most thorough and respectful assessment of Isla's condition that they'd ever experienced. He explained each measurement, described what he was looking for, and consistently asked for Isla's input about comfort and sensation. The process felt more like a consultation between equals than a medical examination. What struck Aurora most was how Evan's attention to detail extended beyond technical requirements to include Isla's preferences and personality. He asked about her favorite colors, her hobbies, her dreams for what she wanted to do once she could. Walk comfortably. These weren't medical questions, but they seemed just as important to his design process. I think we can definitely work with this, Evan said as he finished his notes. You've got good range of motion, strong core strength, and most importantly, you're willing to do the work it takes to succeed. As they prepared to leave, Max approached Isla with something in his hands, a small carved wooden figure that Aurora realized was a miniature version of his prosthetic. I made this in art class, he said, offering it to Isla. It's supposed to remind you that being different doesn't mean being broken. It just means you get cool robot parts that other kids don't have. Isla accepted the gift with reverence, turning it over in her hands as if it were made of precious metal rather than elementary school woodwork. Thank you, she whispered, and Aurora saw tears gathering in her daughter's eyes, tears of gratitude, rather than frustration for the first time in months. Walking back to their car, Isla clutched Max's gift and peppered Aurora with questions about when they could start, how often they'd need to visit, and whether she could really learn to help build her own prosthetics. Aurora found herself answering with a confidence she didn't quite feel, making commitments to a process she didn't fully understand. But as she watched Isla's excitement, genuine, unguarded hope that had been absent from their lives for too long, Aurora realized that understanding could come later. Right now, her daughter needed to believe in possibility, and Aurora was willing to follow her into this unfamiliar world of garage workshops and unconventional expertise. The drive home passed in comfortable silence, both of them lost in their own thoughts about the journey they were about to begin. Aurora's phone buzzed with messages from her assistant about board meetings and corporate decisions. But for once, those demands felt less urgent than the small wooden figure Isla held in her lap, a tangible reminder that some innovations couldn't be purchased, only earned through patience, dedication, and the kind of love that measured success in steps rather than stock prices. 2 weeks into their new routine, Aurora discovered that the community center operated on a different rhythm than anything she'd previously experienced. Board meetings that had once demanded her immediate attention found themselves postponed when Isla's therapy sessions ran long. Conference calls with international shipping partners were rescheduled around Evan's volunteer hours. Her business phone buzzed constantly with increasingly urgent messages from executives who couldn't understand why their CEO was spending her afternoons in a converted warehouse. Mrs. Wyndham, the Tokyo office has been trying to reach you for 3 days. Her assistant Margaret's voice carried through the phone with barely contained exasperation. The Yamamoto contract needs your signature, and the board is asking questions about your availability. Aurora sat in her car outside the community center, watching through the windows as Evan worked with Isla on balance exercises using equipment he'd improvised from automotive suspension components. Her daughter's laughter echoed across the parking lot, a sound that had become increasingly rare over the past year. Tell Tokyo I'll review the contract tonight, Aurora said, her attention divided between the phone call and the scene playing out inside. And schedule the board meeting for Friday afternoon. Friday afternoon conflicts with your daughters. Then move it to Thursday evening, Aurora interrupted, surprising herself with the firmness in her voice. This is important, Margaret. The silence on the other end of the line spoke volumes. In the 3 years since Jonathan's death, Aurora had never prioritized anything above Wyndham Shipping's operations. The company had become her refuge from grief, a place where problems could be solved through careful analysis and strategic thinking. But watching Isla work with Evan challenged everything she'd believed about solutions and success. Inside the center, Evan's approach to therapy defied every clinical model they'd encountered. Instead of sterile exercise routines, he'd created what looked like an obstacle course designed by someone who understood that children learned through play rather than repetition. Foam padding from car seats became balance beams. Hydraulic cylinders from automotive systems were repurposed into resistance training equipment. Everything served dual purposes, building strength while building confidence. The key is making it feel like fun rather than work, Evan had explained during their first week. If Isla thinks of this as playing games instead of doing exercises, she'll push herself harder and recover faster. Aurora had initially dismissed this philosophy as unscientific, but the results spoke for themselves. Isla's core strength had improved noticeably, her balance was more stable, and most importantly, she approached each session with enthusiasm rather than resignation. "Mom, did you see that?" Isla called out as Aurora entered the building, pointing to a foam cylinder she'd successfully navigated without assistance. "Evan says if I can do this 3 times in a row, we can start working on the dynamic response system for my prosthetics." The technical language rolling off her daughter's tongue with casual confidence represented another unexpected development. Evan treated Isla as a collaborator in her own recovery, explaining the engineering principles behind each exercise and involving her in problem-solving when challenges arose. Aurora watched as her 9-year-old daughter discussed joint mechanics and weight distribution with the vocabulary of someone who'd earned the right to understand her own body's capabilities. "That's fantastic, sweetheart," Aurora said, settling into one of the mismatched chairs that served as the center's waiting area. Around her, other parents dealt with their own challenges: insurance paperwork, work schedules disrupted by therapy appointments, and the constant financial calculations that came with medical care. Aurora found herself listening to conversations about co-pays and coverage limits with a growing awareness of her own privilege. "Evan's been telling us about the individual molds he carves for each child," said Maria Santos, whose 7-year-old son, Carlos, was working with a volunteer across the room. "He spent 6 hours last weekend shaping the wood just right for Carlos's leg length. 6 hours of his own time, no charge." Aurora looked across the room to where Evan knelt beside Carlos, making minute adjustments to a practice prosthetic while the boy offered feedback about comfort and fit. The scene carried an intimacy that spoke of genuine investment rather than professional obligation. These weren't clients to Evan. They were individual challenges that demanded creative solutions and personal attention. "How does he afford to do this?" Aurora asked, immediately regretting the question's implication about money. Maria's smile carried understanding rather than judgment. "Same as the rest of us, I guess. You find a way to make room for what matters most. Evan's got his regular job, but this work here, this is what gives his life meaning." The concept of finding meaning through service rather than profit margin represented a paradigm shift that Aurora was still struggling to understand. Her world had always operated on clear transactions, time invested for financial return, expertise purchased at market rates, success measured in quantifiable metrics. But watching Evan work challenged those assumptions at every level. "Aurora, could you come here for a minute?" Evan's voice interrupted her thoughts. "I want to show you something." She approached the workspace where Isla sat surrounded by what looked like the components of a highly sophisticated mechanical system. Aluminum pieces machined to precise tolerances, electronic sensors no bigger than her thumbnail, and articulated joints that moved with fluid grace. "These are the preliminary components for Isla's prosthetics," Evan explained, his hands moving over the pieces with practiced familiarity. "But I want your input on the control system before we finalize anything." Aurora stared at the array of technology, trying to reconcile its sophistication with her assumptions about garage workshop capabilities. "You built all of this yourself? Most of it?" Evan replied. "Some components I had machined at a local shop, but the design and assembly are mine. The sensors here will read pressure and movement patterns, allowing the prosthetics to adjust their response in real time." The technical explanation that followed challenged Aurora's understanding of what was possible outside traditional medical channels. Evan had created what amounted to artificial intelligence for prosthetic limbs, using principles borrowed from automotive engineering and adapted for human biomechanics. The sophistication rivaled anything she'd seen in the expensive medical facilities they'd visited. "How did you learn to do this?" Aurora asked, genuinely curious about the education that had produced such innovation. Evan's laugh carried self-deprecation rather than pride. "YouTube University, mostly. Technical manuals, online forums, trial and error. When Max needed help, I had to figure out how to help him. The learning happened because it had to." The idea that necessity had driven Evan to master multiple complex disciplines spoke to a kind of dedication that Aurora found both humbling and inspiring. While she'd used wealth to purchase expertise, Evan had acquired expertise through determination and love. "The insurance company called again," Isla announced, looking up from the prosthetic components she'd been examining. "They said they need more documentation about medical necessity." Aurora felt familiar frustration rising in her chest. Despite their financial resources, insurance complications had plagued every aspect of Isla's care. Coverage decisions seemed designed to discourage rather than facilitate treatment, creating bureaucratic obstacles that serve no purpose beyond cost containment. "Don't worry about insurance," Aurora said impulsively. "We'll handle the costs directly." A silence that followed her statement felt heavy with implications she hadn't fully considered. Evan's expression shifted from gratitude to something more complex appreciation, mixed with discomfort that spoke to pride and independence she'd inadvertently challenged. "That's very generous," Evan said carefully, "but I want to make sure we're doing this the right way. Isla's prosthetics should be something she earns through her own work, not something that's given to her." Aurora felt heat rise in her cheeks as she realized her mistake. The offer that had seemed generous now felt patronizing, reducing Isla's journey to a transaction rather than an achievement. She'd spent so long solving problems with money that she'd forgotten some solutions couldn't be purchased. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "I didn't mean to imply." "I know you didn't," Evan replied, his voice carrying understanding rather than offense. "But part of what makes this process work is Isla feeling ownership over her recovery. That includes understanding the value of what we're creating together." The lesson was delivered gently but firmly, and Aurora found herself reconsidering not just her approach to Isla's treatment, but her understanding of value itself. In her world, time was money and efficiency was king. But here, the slow process of creation and the patience required for genuine learning carried worth that couldn't be quantified in corporate terms. As the session continued, Aurora's phone continued buzzing with increasing urgency. Messages from board members, updates from international operations, and scheduling conflicts that would normally command her immediate attention. But watching Isla work with concentrated determination, seeing her daughter's confidence grow with each small success, Aurora found herself questioning which demands truly deserved priority. The drive home found mother and daughter discussing prosthetic design with the enthusiasm of engineers working on a fascinating problem. Isla had absorbed technical concepts that would challenge college students. But more importantly, she'd begun thinking of herself as someone capable of understanding and influencing her own treatment. "Evan says that next week we can start testing the preliminary fit," Isla announced as they pulled into their circular driveway. "He wants me to keep a journal of how everything feels so we can make adjustments." Aurora looked at their mansion's imposing facade, its pristine landscaping and architectural perfection, suddenly feeling less like achievement and more like isolation. The contrast between their manicured world and the raw creativity of Evan's workshop highlighted questions about authenticity and connection that she wasn't sure she was ready to explore. But as Isla wheeled herself toward the front door, chattering excitedly about joint mechanics and sensor calibration, Aurora realized that some journeys began with a single step, or in this case, with the promise of steps yet to come. The buzzing. Phone in her purse would have to wait. Some priorities were more important than profit margins, and some investments paid dividends that couldn't be measured in quarterly reports. Evan's garage workshop at home operated by different rules than the community center. Aurora discovered during her first evening visit. The space felt more personal, more intimate, with family photos tucked between technical diagrams and maxes. Homework scattered across surfaces that doubled as design tables. The smell of coffee mixed with metal shavings created an atmosphere that was both industrial and domestic, professional and deeply personal. "I do the detail work here," Evan explained, gesturing toward a workbench where Isla's prosthetic components lay in various stages of completion. "The center has space and equipment for the bigger projects, but this is where the magic happens, where each piece gets shaped to fit exactly right." Aurora watched as he picked up what looked like a wooden sculpture, running his fingers along its contours with the attention of an artist examining a masterpiece. Only closer inspection revealed that this was actually a carved mold, shaped precisely to match Isla's residual limb measurements. Every curve and angle had been crafted by hand, adjusted and readjusted until it achieved perfect anatomical accuracy. "How long did this take?" Aurora asked, studying the craftsmanship that was evident in every detail. "About 12 hours spread over 3 nights," Evan replied, his tone suggesting this was normal rather than extraordinary. "Each child needs individual molds. No two bodies are exactly alike, and comfort depends on getting the fit absolutely perfect." The dedication represented by those 12 hours struck Aurora with unexpected force. While she'd been attending board meetings and managing corporate acquisitions, Evan had been spending his evenings carving wood with the precision of a master craftsman, creating something that existed nowhere else in the world, a perfect interface between technology and her daughter's unique anatomy. Max appeared from the kitchen carrying 2 cups of hot chocolate, one of which he offered to Isla with the easy hospitality of someone accustomed to visitors in their workspace. "Want to see the cool part, Isla? Dad's been working on sensors that can actually feel things." Aurora found herself drawn into a technical demonstration that challenged everything she thought she knew about prosthetic technology. Evan had developed pressure-sensitive components that could distinguish between different surfaces, adjusting their response to provide feedback that mimicked natural sensation. The engineering was sophisticated enough to warrant patents, yet it had emerged from a garage workshop rather than a corporate research facility. "The goal is to give Isla as much natural feeling as possible," Evan explained, connecting sensors to a computer display that showed real-time pressure readings. "These will tell her when she's walking on grass versus concrete, when she's going uphill or downhill, even when she's stepping on something she shouldn't." Isla's eyes widened as she watched the sensors respond to different touches. They're electronic readouts translating pressure into data that would eventually become sensation. "It's like having robot feelings," she said with wonder. "Exactly," Evan smiled. "Robot feelings that belong to you." Aurora observed this interaction with growing awareness of how much she'd underestimated both the technical sophistication of Evan's work and the depth of his understanding of childhood psychology. He spoke to Isla as an equal partner in the creation process, explaining complex concepts without condescension, while maintaining the excitement of shared discovery. The evening progressed with Aurora, finding herself genuinely useful for the first time in months. Her experience managing complex projects translated surprisingly well to prosthetic development, and she found herself coordinating timelines, suggesting process improvements, and even contributing ideas about sensor integration that earned nods of approval from Evan. "You've got good instincts for this," he said as they reviewed the assembly schedule. "Engineering is really just organized problem solving, and you're clearly good at organizing solutions." The compliment carried weight because it came from someone whose expertise Aurora had learned to respect. More importantly, It acknowledged skills she possessed that had value beyond corporate boardrooms, abilities that could contribute to her daughter's recovery in meaningful ways. I've been thinking about the funding situation here, Aurora said carefully, choosing her words to avoid the patronizing tone that had created problems before. Not about paying for individual treatments, but about the center's equipment needs. Some of those machines look like they're held together with hope and duct tape. Evan's hands paused in their work, and Aurora saw him exchange a look with Max that spoke to conversations they'd had about the center's precarious financial situation. The center runs on donations and volunteer labor, Evan said slowly. We make do with what we have, but you're right, some of the equipment is past its prime. The physical therapy mats are wearing through, and the parallel bars need replacement parts we can't afford. Aurora had spent the past week quietly researching the center's operations, learning about budget constraints that forced difficult choices between necessary repairs and program expansion. The facility served twice as many families as it had been designed for, stretching resources and staff to their limits. What if there was a way to address those needs without changing the center's independence? Aurora asked. A grant program, maybe, or equipment donations that came without strings attached. The question hung in the air between them, carrying implications that extended beyond practical logistics. Aurora was proposing to help, but in a way that preserved the center's autonomy and Evan's dignity. It was a delicate balance between addressing real needs and maintaining the authentic relationships that made the center special. That would make a huge difference, Evan admitted. But it would have to be done right. The families here need to know they're earning their children's progress, not receiving charity. Aurora nodded, understanding the distinction he was making. The center's power came from its community spirit, from the sense that everyone contributed according to their abilities. Her challenge was to help without undermining that essential dynamic. As they worked side by side, Aurora found herself studying Evan's hands as they shaped and adjusted prosthetic components. They were working hands, marked by years of honest labor, but they moved with surgical precision when handling delicate electronics. The contradiction fascinated her, this combination of blue-collar authenticity and sophisticated technical knowledge. How do you balance it all? She asked impulsively. Work, Max, the volunteering, this level of craftsmanship. It seems impossible. Evan looked up from the component he'd been adjusting, his expression thoughtful. I guess you make time for what matters most. Max needed help, so I learned how to help him. Other kids needed the same kind of help, so I figured out how to share what I'd learned. It's not really balance. It's more like building something that's bigger than just your own problems. The philosophy underlying his words challenged Aurora's understanding of success and fulfillment. Her life had been structured around acquiring and protecting wealth, status, control over outcomes. But Evan had built his life around giving and creating, finding purpose through service rather than accumulation. I used to think differently, Aurora found herself saying. Before Isla's accident, before Jonathan died, I thought success meant having enough money and influence to solve any problem. But some problems can't be solved with resources alone. Money helps, Evan said pragmatically. Don't get me wrong, having enough to pay bills and buy materials makes everything easier. But the actual solutions usually come from caring enough to keep trying when things don't work the first time. Max looked up from where he'd been organizing sensor components. Dad says the best inventions come from love, not from being smart. Aurora felt something tighten in her chest at the simple wisdom contained in that observation. Her daughter's condition had driven her to seek the smartest doctors, the most advanced facilities, the most expensive treatments. But it had taken a mechanic working from love rather than profit to create innovations that actually addressed Isla's individual needs. Speaking of inventions, Evan said, reaching for a notebook filled with sketches, I've been working on something special for the ankle joint. Want to see? The drawings revealed a mechanism that looked like it belonged in a science fiction movie rather than a prosthetic device. Evan had designed an artificial ankle that could adapt its stiffness in real time, providing firm support for walking while remaining flexible enough for running or jumping. The sensors read the type of movement Isla is trying to make, he explained, his finger tracing the technical details, and the joint adjusts accordingly. Walking gets stable support, but if she wants to run or play, it becomes more responsive. Aurora studied the drawings, noting innovations that seemed to anticipate problems she hadn't even considered. This is incredible. Have you shown this to any medical professionals? A few, Evan replied. Most of them are interested, but concerned about liability and FDA approval. The regulatory process for medical devices can take years and cost millions. That's why I focus on custom builds for individual kids. It's legal as long as I'm not selling anything. The explanation revealed another layer of the challenges facing innovative solutions in medical care. Evan's designs might be superior to commercially available options, but bureaucratic obstacles prevented their wider adoption. Innovation was being stifled by systems designed to protect institutions rather than serve patients. What would it take to get something like this approved for broader use? Aurora asked, her business instincts engaging with a problem that seemed solvable through the right combination of resources and expertise. Time, money, and patience, Evan said, plus connections to people who understand both the technical and regulatory sides. It's not impossible, but it's complicated enough that most inventors give up before they get through the process. Aurora found herself thinking about the corporate networks she'd built over years of business development, the regulatory experts she'd worked with on shipping industry compliance, the legal teams that specialized in navigating complex approval processes. For the first time since Isla's accident, she felt like her professional skills might be directly applicable to her daughter's needs. What if that wasn't an obstacle? She asked quietly. What if someone could handle the regulatory side while you focused on the innovation? Evan's hands stilled over his work, and Aurora saw him processing the implications of her question. They were moving into territory that neither of them had expected to explore, a potential partnership that could transform not just Isla's treatment, but the treatment available to countless other children. That would change everything, he said finally. But it would also change this. He gestured around the garage workshop with its intimate scale and personal touch. I'm not sure I want to lose what makes this special. Aurora understood his concern. The authenticity and individual attention that characterized Evan's work might not survive the scaling and systematization required for broader adoption. There was a tension between helping more children and preserving the personal relationships that made help meaningful. As the evening wound down, Aurora found herself reluctant to leave this space where problems were solved through ingenuity, rather than purchasing power. Watching Isla help Max organize tools, seeing her daughter's growing confidence and technical knowledge, she realized that the most valuable aspects of their experience couldn't be replicated in more formal settings. The drive home passed in comfortable silence, both Aurora and Isla lost in their own thoughts about the evening's discoveries. Aurora's phone had been mercifully quiet, allowing her to focus completely on prosthetic design and family dynamics. For the first time in years, "Mom," Isla said as they pulled into their driveway, "do you think we could learn to make things like Evan does? Not just for me, but for other kids too?" The question carried implications that Aurora wasn't sure she was ready to explore. Her daughter was suggesting a fundamental shift in how they approached problems and solutions, moving from consumers of expertise to creators of innovation. It was an appealing possibility, but one that would require changes Aurora wasn't sure she was prepared to make. "Maybe," she said carefully. "It would be a big change for both of us." "I think it would be a good change," Isla replied with the certainty of someone who'd found something worth pursuing. "I think we could help a lot of people." As they entered their mansion's pristine interior, Aurora found herself seeing their surroundings with new eyes. The perfect surfaces and carefully arranged furniture felt suddenly sterile compared to the creative chaos of Evan's workshop. She wondered if there might be room in their lives for the kind of meaningful work that left grease stains on your hands and satisfaction in your heart. The basement workshop Aurora discovered in her mansion's lower level felt like an archaeological find from a different era of her life. Dust covers draped over expensive woodworking equipment that Jonathan had purchased during their early years of marriage, back when they'd still talked about building things together instead of just buying them. The air smelled of old wood and abandonment, carrying memories of dreams that had been set aside for corporate priorities. "I'd forgotten most of this was down here," Aurora admitted to Isla as they explored the space together. "Your father was always going to build you a treehouse, make furniture for your room. We had all these plans." Isla rolled her wheelchair between workbenches that hadn't been touched in years, running her fingers along tool handles that still bore traces of Jonathan's grip. Why didn't he ever use it? Aurora felt the familiar tightness in her chest that came with honest self-reflection. "We got busy with the company. There was always another deal to close, another problem to solve. We kept saying we'd have time later." The discovery of her late husband's workshop came with a revelation that changed Aurora's understanding of both her past and her possibilities. Among Jonathan's papers, she found detailed plans for prosthetic devices research he'd been conducting. After Isla's accident, technical drawings that showed remarkable sophistication for someone without medical training. "He was working on this," Aurora said quietly, studying her husband's sketches with new appreciation. "He knew I couldn't fix Isla's condition with money, so he was trying to learn how to fix it with his hands." The drawings revealed that Jonathan had been following a path remarkably similar to Evan's, starting with basic mechanical principles and gradually developing more sophisticated understanding of biomechanics and adaptive engineering. His notes included contact information for university researchers, medical professionals, and other parents who'd found innovative solutions to their children's challenges. "Dad would have liked Evan," Isla observed, comparing her father's sketches to the prosthetic components they'd been working on at the community center. "They think about problems the same way." Aurora found herself nodding, recognizing similarities she hadn't seen before. Both men approached challenges with patient determination, breaking complex problems into manageable components and refusing to accept that limitations were permanent. The difference was that Jonathan had died before his research could bear fruit, while Evan had been given the time to transform learning into expertise. That evening, Aurora made a decision that surprised even herself. Instead of attending the quarterly board meeting that had been rescheduled twice already, she called Evan and asked if she could spend the evening in his workshop learning the basics of prosthetic construction. "You sure you want to get your hands dirty?" Evan asked, with gentle amusement as Aurora arrived wearing jeans and an old sweater she'd found in the back of her closet. "I found my husband's workshop tonight," Aurora replied. "Realized I've been buying solutions instead of creating them for too long." The next 3 hours challenged Aurora in ways her corporate experience had never prepared her for. Working with hand tools required patience she'd never had to develop, attention to detail that couldn't be delegated, and acceptance of mistakes that had to be corrected rather than ignored. By the end of the evening, her manicured nails were ruined and her back ached from unfamiliar postures. But she'd successfully shaped a piece of aluminum that would become part of Isla's prosthetic suspension system. "Not bad for a beginner," Evan said, examining her work with professional assessment. "The angles are clean, and you've got good intuition for the metal's properties." The praise meant more to Aurora than any quarterly earnings report she'd ever received. This was achievement measured in millimeters and functionality rather than profit margins and stock prices. She understood, for the first time, why Evan found such satisfaction in his evening work. I want to learn more, Aurora said impulsively. Not just for Isla, but because I think I've been missing something important about how to make a difference. Evan studied her face, perhaps assessing whether her interest was genuine or temporary. It's not easy work. Takes time to develop the skills, and there's no guarantee of success. You comfortable with that? Aurora thought about her husband's unfinished projects, about the workshop that had been gathering dust while she focused on corporate achievements that felt increasingly hollow. I think I've been playing it too safe for too long. As their work sessions continued over the following weeks, Aurora found herself developing not just technical skills, but a different relationship with time itself. Corporate deadlines had always created artificial urgency, pressure to make decisions quickly and move on to the next challenge. But prosthetic work demanded patience time for components to cure properly, for adjustments to be tested thoroughly, for the slow process of getting details exactly right. The children teach you to slow down, Evan observed during one of their sessions. They can tell when you're rushing, when you're more focused on finishing than on doing things right. Quality takes time, and they deserve quality. Aurora began to understand that Evan's volunteer work wasn't just about helping individual children. It was about maintaining a different set of values in a world that prioritized speed over craftsmanship, efficiency over empathy. The community center represented a pocket of resistance against the commodification of care. But even as Aurora found satisfaction in hands-on work, the pressures of her corporate responsibilities continued to mount. Board members were expressing increasing concern about her availability. Major contracts were being delayed by her absence from negotiations, and competitors were taking advantage of her distracted leadership. You can't keep this up indefinitely, her assistant Margaret warned during one of their increasingly brief phone conversations. The Tokyo partnership alone represents $50 million in annual revenue. They need face-to-face meetings, not proxy decisions. Aurora knew Margaret was right, but the corporate world that had once felt vital now seemed abstract and disconnected from real human needs. Watching Isla's progress, seeing her daughter's growing confidence and technical knowledge, made quarterly reports feel like elaborate distractions from what actually mattered. The tension came to a head during a community center fundraising meeting that Aurora had agreed to attend. The center faced potential closure due to funding cuts, and the families served by its programs were organizing to find solutions. Aurora listened to parents describe the impact of reduced services, the waiting lists for equipment, and the children who would lose access to care they couldn't afford elsewhere. We're looking at cutting the weekend programs, Linda explained to the gathered families. The volunteer staff is willing to continue donating their time, but we can't afford the facility costs without additional funding. Aurora found herself studying the faces around the room, parents who worked multiple jobs to cover their children's basic needs, volunteers who gave their evenings and weekends to support other families, children whose progress depended on programs that measured success in steps rather than dollars. The contrast with her boardroom meetings, where decisions affecting millions were made by people who would never be touched by the consequences, was stark and troubling. What would it take to maintain the current level of service? Aurora asked, her business instincts engaging with a problem that seemed both solvable and urgent. The numbers were revealing. The center's annual operating budget was less than Aurora's company spent on executive travel. The equipment needs that seemed insurmountable to families living paycheck to paycheck could be addressed with what amounted to rounding errors in corporate accounting. But Aurora had learned enough about the center's culture to know that simple financial solutions could destroy the very qualities that made it special. The family's investment of time and effort created ownership and community that couldn't be purchased. Her challenge was to help without undermining the relationships that made help meaningful. I may have some ideas, Aurora said carefully, but I'd want to make sure any solutions preserve what makes this place work. As the meeting continued, Aurora found herself thinking about her husband's unfinished workshop, about the dreams they'd set aside for corporate obligations, about the difference between building wealth and building something that mattered. The center faced challenges that couldn't be solved through acquisition or strategic planning, but they might be addressed through the kind of patient, collaborative work she'd been learning in Evan's garage. Driving home with Isla, Aurora made a decision that would have been unthinkable 6 months earlier. Instead of rushing back to her corporate responsibilities, she would take time to understand what the center really needed and how she could help without destroying its essential character. "The board is going to be upset," she said aloud, as much to herself as to Isla. "But we'll be helping kids walk," Isla replied with the clarity of someone who understood the difference between important and urgent. "That seems more important than board meetings." Aurora found herself smiling, despite her anxiety about the corporate consequences of her shifting priorities. Her daughter was right. Some things were more important than quarterly earnings, and some investments paid dividends that couldn't be measured in financial terms. The moment Isla took her first unassisted steps in her new prosthetics, the entire community center fell silent. 7 weeks of careful construction, countless hours of fitting and adjustment, and endless patience had culminated in this singular achievement: a 9-year-old girl walking across a worn gymnasium floor with the natural grace that had been stolen from her 5 years earlier. Aurora watched through tears she couldn't control as her daughter moved forward with careful but confident steps, each one a declaration of independence that transcended the technical achievement of Evan's engineering. The prosthetics responded to Isla's movements with fluid precision, the sensors adjusting support and flexibility in real time, creating an interface between technology and humanity that felt like magic. "Look, Mom," Isla called out, her voice carrying wonder and joy in equal measure. "I can feel the floor. The sensors really work. I can tell when it changes from smooth to rough." The gathered families erupted in applause, parents and children celebrating an achievement that belonged to all of them. Evan stood beside his workbench, tools still in hand, his face reflecting the quiet satisfaction of someone who'd solved a problem that mattered. Max jumped up and down beside him, his excitement pure and uninhibited. Aurora moved toward her daughter with steps that felt unsteady despite her intact legs. The moment felt too precious, too perfect, to be real. As Isla reached her arms up for an embrace, Aurora knelt to meet her, and for the first time in 5 years, her daughter stood without assistance while they held each other. "I knew you could do it," Aurora whispered, her voice thick with emotion. She'd been holding back for months. "We did it," Isla corrected, and Aurora understood that the pronoun included not just herself and her daughter, but Evan and Max and the entire community that had supported this achievement. The celebration was interrupted by Aurora's phone, which had been buzzing insistently for the past hour. She'd ignored it during Isla's fitting session, prioritizing this moment over whatever corporate crisis demanded her attention. But the persistent ringing finally broke through her concentration. "I need to take this," she said apologetically to Evan, stepping into the corridor for privacy. "Mrs. Wyndham, thank God." Margaret's voice carried panic that immediately put Aurora on high alert. "I've been trying to reach you for hours. We have a situation." Aurora felt the familiar weight of corporate responsibility settling back onto her shoulders. What kind of situation? The Riverside Development Project. The one that's been stalled in city planning for months. Apparently, it's been fast-tracked and construction starts Monday. The problem is, Margaret's voice trailed off in a way that suggested bad news was coming. "The problem is what?" Aurora pressed, her attention still half focused on the celebration, continuing in the gymnasium behind her. "The project site includes the community center, the building and the surrounding block. Everything's been marked for demolition to make way for the new shipping facility." Aurora felt the floor seem to shift beneath her feet. "That's impossible." I would have been informed of any project affecting. She stopped mid-sentence as understanding hit her like a physical blow. Which subsidiary is handling the development? Wyndham Maritime Development. It's been in planning for 18 months, approved at the executive level. Your signature is on the preliminary permits, Mrs. Wyndham, from before your daughter started. Therapy there. Aurora closed her eyes, feeling the weight of unintended consequences settling around her. 18 months ago, the Riverside Development Project had been just another line item in a portfolio of urban renewal initiatives. She'd signed off on dozens of similar projects without considering their human impact, focused on profit margins and strategic positioning rather than the communities that would be displaced. How long do we have? Aurora asked, though she dreaded the answer. The demolition is scheduled for next Friday. The legal notices went out last week, but apparently they were sent to an outdated mailing address for the community center. Mrs. Wyndham, I think there might be a conflict of interest issue here that we need to. Aurora ended the call without hearing the rest of Margaret's warning. She stood in the corridor, listening to the sounds of celebration from the gymnasium, and felt a crushing weight of irony settle over her. Her own company, the wealth and influence she'd used to justify her absence from Isla's care, was directly responsible for destroying the place that had given her daughter the ability to walk again. When she returned to the gymnasium, the celebration was in full swing. Isla was demonstrating her prosthetics to other children, explaining the sensor system with the enthusiasm of someone who'd helped create what she was using. Evan was answering technical questions from interested parents, his quiet pride evident in the way he described the collaborative process that had made Isla's success possible. Aurora, you missed the best part, called Maria Santos, whose son. Carlos had been one of Evan's first success stories. Isla was telling us how the ankle joint adapts to different surfaces. It's remarkable technology. Aurora tried to smile, tried to maintain the facade of celebration, while her mind raced through the implications of what she'd learned. In 1 week, this building would be reduced to rubble. The family celebrating today would lose access to the only affordable rehabilitation services in the city. Evan's workshop, with its carefully organized tools and ongoing projects, would be destroyed to make way for a shipping facility that would generate profit for her company. Mom, are you okay? Isla's voice cut through Aurora's internal turmoil. Her daughter had approached with the careful gait of someone still adjusting to new sensations, but her face carried concern that was entirely focused on Aurora's emotional state. I'm fine, sweetheart, Aurora lied, the words coming automatically, despite their obvious falseness. Just thinking about how proud I am of you. But Isla had developed the perceptiveness that came with navigating adult emotions from a wheelchair-bound perspective. She could read the subtle changes in posture and expression that others might miss. Something's wrong, Isla said quietly. You look like you did when Dad was sick. The comparison hit Aurora harder than any corporate crisis ever had. During Jonathan's illness, she'd fought desperately against circumstances beyond her control, using every resource at her disposal to find solutions that didn't exist. Now she faced a different kind of helplessness, the knowledge that her own decisions had created a problem that money and influence might not be able to fix. We need to talk to Evan, Aurora said, making a decision that felt both necessary and terrifying. She found him in his workshop area, carefully cleaning the tools he'd used for Isla's final fitting. The space carried the satisfied air of a job. Completed successfully, technical drawings and component lists organized for future reference. Aurora realized she was looking at the workspace of someone who planned to continue this work for years to come, someone who had no idea that his efforts were about to be rendered meaningless by forces beyond his control. Evan, I need to tell you something, Aurora began, her voice catching despite her efforts to remain composed. Something I just learned about this building. The conversation that followed was one of the most difficult Aurora had ever had. She explained the development project, her company's involvement, and the timeline that would see the community center demolished within a week. She watched as understanding dawned on Evan's face, followed by emotions that shifted from shock to anger to something that looked like profound disappointment. "Your company," Evan said quietly, his voice carrying no accusation, but somehow making Aurora feel worse than if he'd shouted at her. "All this time you were learning about our work while your company was planning to destroy it." "I didn't know," Aurora said, the words sounding inadequate even to her own ears. "I signed dozens of development approvals. I never connected this location to the center until today." Evan stood silent for a long moment, his hands still holding the tools he'd been cleaning. Around them, the celebration continued, families and children unaware that their world was about to be upended by corporate decisions made in boardrooms they'd never see. "What does this mean for the kids?" Evan asked finally, and Aurora heard. In his voice, the same question she'd been avoiding. What happened to children like Isla when the system supporting them disappeared without warning? "I don't know," Aurora admitted, "but I'm going to find out. And I'm going to fix this." Even as she spoke the words, Aurora wasn't sure how such a promise could be kept. Corporate development projects involved millions of dollars, legal contracts, and business relationships that couldn't be easily unwound. The machinery of profit and progress had been set in motion long before she'd understood what would be destroyed in its path. "How?" Evan asked, and the simplicity of the question cut to the heart of Aurora's uncertainty. She looked around the workshop that had become a second home to her and Isla, at the careful organization of tools and materials that represented not just technical expertise, but genuine care for the children who depended on Evan's innovations. In 1 week, none of this would exist except in the memories of families who'd found hope in an unlikely place. "I don't know yet," Aurora said honestly, "but I know I can't let this happen. Not after what you've given us. Not after what you've given Isla." The weight of unintended consequences had never felt heavier. But as Aurora watched her daughter demonstrate her new mobility to other children, she knew that some mistakes demanded more than apologies. They demanded transformation of the systems that had created them in the first place. Aurora spent the weekend locked in her home office, surrounded by legal documents, development contracts, and financial projections that painted an increasingly grim picture of her options. The Riverside Development Project involved not just her company, but a consortium of investors, municipal development authorities, and federal funding that created a web of obligations and penalties that couldn't be easily untangled. The cancellation costs alone would be astronomical, her legal team had explained during an emergency conference call Saturday morning. "We're talking about $40 million in sunk costs, plus penalties for breach of contract with subcontractors. The board would never approve it, and frankly, there might be grounds for shareholder lawsuits if you tried to force it through." Aurora stared at the cityscape beyond her office windows, watching the lights flicker on in buildings that housed thousands of people going about their evening routines, unaware that corporate decisions made in offices like hers could reshape their neighborhoods without warning or consultation. What about relocation assistance for the affected businesses? Aurora asked, though she already suspected the answer. "The community center isn't a business in the traditional sense," her attorney replied. "They're classified as a nonprofit service organization. There are provisions for notification, but no requirement for relocation compensation. Legally, we're in the clear." The phrase, "legally in the clear," felt like a judgment rather than reassurance. Aurora understood now why her husband had grown increasingly uncomfortable with the shipping industry's impact on urban communities. Legal compliance was a low bar when measured against human consequences. Sunday morning found Aurora at the community center, not for Isla's therapy session, but to meet with families who'd gathered to discuss their options. Word of the development project had spread quickly through the tight-knit community, creating an atmosphere of desperate urgency that reminded Aurora of corporate crisis meetings, except the stakes here were measured in children's futures rather than quarterly earnings. We've contacted every city council member, the mayor's office, and the state representatives, Linda reported to the assembled group. Nobody seems able or willing to intervene in a private development project, especially one that promises job creation and increased tax revenue. Aurora listened to families describe their search for alternative therapy options, their calls to insurance companies about coverage at other facilities, their growing realization that the center's unique combination of affordability and innovation couldn't be replicated elsewhere. The waiting lists at other facilities stretched for months, and none offered the kind of individualized prosthetic services that Evan provided. "My daughter Emma was supposed to start working with Evan next month," said a woman Aurora recognized from previous visits. "We've been saving for 8 months to afford the materials, and Emma's been so excited. Now we don't know where to turn." Evan sat quietly through most of the meeting, his usual calm demeanor replaced by something that looked like barely controlled frustration. When he finally spoke, his words carried the weight of someone who'd spent the weekend calculating the human cost of corporate efficiency. "I've been trying to figure out what we can save," he said, his voice steady despite the emotion Aurora could see in his eyes. "Some of the equipment can be moved, and I can probably relocate my workshop to my garage, at least temporarily. But we're going to lose the physical therapy space, the group programs, and most importantly, we're going to lose the community that makes this place work." The statement hung in the air like a diagnosis of terminal illness. Aurora realized that Evan understood something about their situation that her legal team had missed. The center's value couldn't be quantified in terms of assets and services. Its power came from the relationships between families, the shared experience of overcoming challenges together, the sense of community that transformed individual struggles into collective strength. "What if we fought this?" asked Maria Santos, her voice carrying more hope than confidence. "What if we organized protests, got media attention, forced them to reconsider?" Aurora felt the weight of her insider knowledge pressing against her chest. She knew the development timeline, the financial commitments, the political pressures that made cancellation unlikely, regardless of public opposition. But she also knew something the others didn't. She had access to the corporate decision-making process in ways that external protesters never could. "There might be another way," Aurora said quietly, surprised by her own words. The room fell silent, all attention focused on her with an intensity that made her acutely aware of the responsibility she was accepting. These families were looking to her for hope, but the solution that was forming in her mind would require sacrifices that might transform not just the center's future, but her own. "I need to make some calls," Aurora continued, her voice gaining strength as her resolve crystallized. "There are options we haven't explored yet, but they're going to require some creative thinking." The meeting broke up with tentative optimism, families exchanging contact information and making plans to coordinate whatever resistance might be possible. Aurora found herself walking to the parking lot with Evan, both of them lost in their own thoughts about the challenge ahead. "What are you thinking?" Evan asked as they reached her car. Aurora looked back at the building that had become so important to both their families, noting details she'd never paid attention to before: the hand-painted signs, the carefully tended garden that the children maintained, the accessible ramps that had been added with volunteer labor and donated materials. "I'm thinking about what my husband would have done," she said slowly. "Jonathan always said that the shipping business was about connecting people and opportunities across distances. Maybe it's time to apply that philosophy to connecting solutions with problems." Evan studied her face with the same careful attention he gave to technical challenges. "That sounds like you're planning something that's going to be complicated." "Very complicated," Aurora agreed, "and possibly expensive." and definitely risky. But possible? Aurora thought about the corporate networks she'd built over 15 years of business development, the regulatory experts she'd worked with, the legal strategies that had solved seemingly impossible problems in international commerce. The community center faced destruction by the same corporate systems she'd mastered. But those systems might also contain the tools for its salvation. I think so, she said finally. But it's going to require some help from people who understand how to work within the system while fighting against it. Monday morning brought Aurora face to face with her board of directors in a conference room that felt increasingly foreign despite years of familiar use. The mahogany table, leather chairs, and panoramic city views suddenly seemed designed to insulate decision-makers from the consequences of their choices. She'd called an emergency meeting to discuss strategic modifications to the Riverside Development Project, though she hadn't yet revealed the specific nature of those modifications. The community impact assessment raises some concerns about public relations, Aurora began, choosing her words carefully to frame the center's closure as a business problem rather than a moral one. We're looking at potential negative media coverage, community organizing, and possible delays that could affect our timeline. Board member Richard Blackwell, who'd been questioning Aurora's availability and decision-making for months, leaned forward with obvious skepticism. Aurora, this project has been in development for over a year. The community impact was thoroughly evaluated during the planning phase. What's changed? Aurora met his gaze directly, drawing on every negotiation skill she'd developed over her career. What's changed is my understanding of the specific services being displaced and their impact on families throughout the region. The community center provides specialized rehabilitation services that aren't available elsewhere, serving children with disabilities whose families can't afford private alternatives. That's unfortunate, said board member Catherine Morrison, her tone suggesting sympathy that didn't extend to changing business plans. But it's not our responsibility to provide social services. Our obligation is to our shareholders and the economic development of the region. Aurora had expected this response, but hearing it spoken aloud in the sterile environment of the boardroom crystallized her understanding of the fundamental disconnect between corporate decision-making and human consequences. The sane detachment that had allowed her to approve the project initially now prevented her colleagues from seeing why it should be reconsidered. The emergency board meeting called for Friday morning felt like a tribunal rather than a corporate discussion. Aurora sat at the head of the conference table, facing colleagues who'd supported her leadership for 3 years, but now viewed her. Recent decisions with expressions ranging from concern to barely concealed hostility. The mahogany surface between them was covered with financial projections, legal documents, and the corporate bylaws that would determine whether she retained control of Wyndham Shipping. Aurora, we've called this meeting because you're recent. Actions have raised serious questions about your fitness to continue as CEO, Richard Blackwell announced, his voice carrying the formal tone of someone delivering a prepared statement. The Riverside Project decision, your extended absences from corporate responsibilities, and your personal financial exposure have created liability issues that the board cannot ignore. Aurora had spent the previous night preparing for this confrontation, reviewing the corporate governance documents that Jonathan had helped draft during the company's early expansion. She understood the legal mechanisms her board could use to remove her, but she also understood the leverage she retained as majority shareholder and the daughter of the company's founder. I appreciate your concerns, Aurora replied, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. But I want to address a fundamental misunderstanding about my recent decisions and their impact on company operations. Catherine Morrison leaned forward, her expression skeptical. Aurora, you've committed 60% of your personal wealth to save a community center that serves perhaps 100 families. From a business perspective, that's not a misunderstanding. It's a profound error in judgment. Aurora reached for the folder she'd prepared, containing documents that would either vindicate her strategy or provide evidence for her removal. Actually, Catherine, what I've done is identify an untapped market opportunity that could transform not just Wyndham Shipping's profit margins, but our entire business model. The presentation that followed challenged everything Aurora's board believed about corporate social responsibility and market positioning. She outlined a vision for adaptive technology development that would leverage Evans' innovations, the community center's real-world testing environment, and Wyndham Shipping's manufacturing and distribution networks to create a new revenue stream focused on affordable medical devices. The prosthetic device market is currently dominated by companies that focus on high-end solutions for affluent patients. Aurora explained, displaying market research she'd commissioned during her sleepless nights. But there's a massive underserved population: children from working-class families, adults in developing countries, anyone who needs adaptive technology but can't afford premium pricing. Blackwell studied the financial projections with obvious skepticism. You're proposing that we enter a highly regulated medical device market with no relevant expertise, based on the innovations of an auto mechanic working out of a garage workshop. I'm proposing that we partner with someone whose innovations have already proven more effective than commercially available alternatives, Aurora corrected. Evan Cole's prosthetic designs aren't garage workshop experiments. They're sophisticated engineering solutions that happen to be developed outside traditional medical industry channels. The room fell silent as board members processed the implications of Aurora's proposal. She was asking them to bet the company's future on a business model that challenged conventional wisdom about market development, regulatory compliance, and corporate expertise. Even if Cole's innovations are as sophisticated as you claim, Morrison said slowly, the regulatory approval process for medical devices can take years and cost millions. How do you propose to bridge that gap? Aurora felt a familiar surge of confidence as the conversation shifted from emotional concerns to practical challenges, the kind of complex problem-solving that had built Wyndham Shipping into an international presence. Through the same international partnerships and regulatory expertise we've developed for shipping compliance, she replied. We already have relationships with regulatory specialists in 12 countries, legal teams that understand complex approval, processes, and distribution networks that can reach underserved populations globally. What followed was the most intense strategic discussion Aurora had experienced since taking over as CEO. Board members raised concerns about liability, market competition, and resource allocation that required detailed responses backed by extensive research. Aurora found herself defending not just her business strategy, but her understanding of the intersection between social impact and profitable enterprise. You're asking us to fundamentally change what kind of company we are, said board member James Chun, who'd remained quiet through most of the discussion. Wyndham Shipping has succeeded by focusing on logistics and transportation. Why would we want to complicate that with medical device development? Aurora thought about her husband's vision for the company, about his belief that successful businesses created value for communities rather than simply extracting profit from them. Because the logistics and transportation expertise we've developed can solve problems in medical device distribution that haven't been addressed by companies focused purely on device development. The debate continued for 3 hours, with board members challenging every aspect of Aurora's proposal, while she defended a vision that felt both revolutionary and inevitable. She was asking them to approve a business strategy that would transform Wyndham Shipping from a traditional transportation company into something more complex and potentially more valuable. I need to see detailed financial projections, Morrison said finally. Risk assessments, regulatory compliance costs, competitive analysis. If you're serious about this, we need data that supports your assumptions. I've already commissioned that analysis, Aurora replied, producing a second folder that contained the kind of detailed business plan she'd normally present for major acquisitions. Everything you're asking for is here, along with preliminary partnership agreements and development timelines. As board members reviewed documents that represented weeks of intensive research and strategic planning, Aurora felt the weight of her gambles settling around her. She'd committed her personal fortune and her corporate reputation to a vision that required her colleagues to trust her judgment, despite their reservations about her recent behavior. "This is remarkably thorough," Shun admitted, studying financial projections that showed potential revenue streams from adaptive technology licensing, international distribution partnerships, and direct-to-consumer sales. But it's also incredibly ambitious. You're proposing to revolutionize medical device accessibility while maintaining our core shipping operations. I'm proposing to apply our core competencies to solve problems that matter, Aurora corrected. Evan Cole has proven that innovative engineering can create superior solutions at lower costs. Our challenge is to scale those innovations and make them available to families who need them. The discussion that followed revealed fundamental differences in how board members understood corporate responsibility and market opportunity. Some saw Aurora's proposal as an expensive distraction from proven business models, while others recognized the potential for significant competitive advantage in emerging markets. "What about Cole himself?" Blackwell asked. "You're basing this entire strategy on one person's innovations. What happens if he's not interested in commercial partnerships? Or if his garage workshop can't scale to manufacturing requirements?" Aurora smiled, remembering her conversations with Evan about the regulatory obstacles that had prevented his innovations from reaching broader audiences. "Actually, Richard, that's the one aspect of this plan I'm confident about. Evan has been hoping for exactly this kind of opportunity, the chance to help more children while maintaining the individual attention that makes his work special." The room fell quiet as Aurora's board processed the full scope of her proposal. She was asking them to approve a business transformation that would leverage everything Wyndham Shipping had learned about international commerce, regulatory compliance, and efficient distribution, while moving into markets that required entirely new expertise. "I need a formal vote," Aurora said finally, recognizing that further discussion would only create more opportunities for doubt and opposition. "Either you trust my judgment and approve this strategic direction, or you remove me as CEO and find someone else to manage decline in traditional shipping markets." The ultimatum hung in the air between them, forcing her board to choose between the familiar comfort of proven business models and the Cole's uncertain promise of innovation-driven growth. Aurora watched their faces, seeing calculations that went beyond financial projections to include personal relationships, corporate culture, and their own appetite for risk. The vote that would determine Aurora's future as CEO and the fate of her ambitious partnership with Evan was scheduled for 2 p.m., giving board members 3 hours to review financial projections and consult with their own advisors. Aurora used the break to drive to the community center, needing to see the place that had transformed her understanding of value and success before learning whether her corporate colleagues shared that vision. She found Evan in his workshop, surrounded by the components for 3 different prosthetic projects, and looking remarkably calm for someone whose future was being decided in a boardroom across town. Isla and Max sat at a child-sized table nearby, working on what appeared to be technical drawings for a new type of adaptive equipment. "How did it go?" Evan asked, looking up from the ankle joint he'd been adjusting. "They're voting this afternoon," Aurora replied, settling into a chair that had become familiar over the months of her involvement. "Either they approve the partnership and we move forward together, or they remove me as CEO and you continue your work here independently." Evan studied her face with the careful attention he gave to engineering problems. "You sound remarkably peaceful for someone whose career is on the line." Aurora looked around the workshop that had become a second home, noting details that would have seemed chaotic months ago, but now represented the organized creativity of someone who built solutions rather than purchased them. I realized something this morning. Win or lose, I'm not the same person who walked into this building 6 months ago. None of us are, Evan agreed, his attention returning to his work. Isla's transformation has been remarkable, but watching her mother learn to build things instead of buying them has been equally impressive. The compliment carried weight because it came from someone whose respect Aurora had earned through competence rather than inherited through position. She'd learned to shape metal, calibrate sensors, and troubleshoot mechanical problems that required patience rather than authority to solve. Evan, I need to ask you something important, Aurora said, her voice carrying the seriousness of someone preparing for multiple possible futures. If the board approves the partnership, are you ready for what that means? This wouldn't be volunteer work anymore. It would be building a business that could reach thousands of children instead of dozens. Evan set down his tools and gave Aurora his full attention. I've been thinking about that question since you first mentioned the possibility. The answer is yes, but only if we can do it without losing what makes this place special. What do you mean? I mean individual attention, custom solutions, families feeling like partners rather than customers. If scaling up means turning prosthetic development into an assembly line process, then I'm not interested. Aurora nodded, understanding the distinction he was making. What if scaling up meant training other people to work the way you work? Teaching your methods to engineers and technicians who shared your values? That might work, Evan said slowly, but it would require finding the right people. People who understand that this isn't just about technical specifications, about giving children confidence to move through the world on their own terms. Their conversation was interrupted by Linda, who appeared in the workshop doorway with an expression of barely contained excitement. Aurora, there are news vans outside. Reporters asking about the development project and the community center. Did you know they were coming? Aurora felt her stomach tighten with sudden anxiety. Media attention could complicate everything, especially if reporters framed the story in ways that made her board more concerned about public relations than market opportunity. I didn't contact anyone, Aurora said, moving toward the window to assess the situation. But word about the development cancellation has probably reached City Hall, and community interest stories are popular content. What she saw outside made her realize that the situation was more complex than simple news coverage. 3 television crews had set up on the sidewalk, along with print reporters conducting interviews with families who'd gathered to support the center. Signs reading "Save Our Kids," "Future," and "Innovation over Profit" suggested that someone had organized a media campaign designed to pressure the board's decision. This could help or hurt us, Aurora said to Evan, watching a reporter interview Maria Santos about her son's progress. Positive coverage might convince the board that community support translates to market validation, but they might also see it as emotional manipulation rather than business strategy. Aurora's phone buzzed with a text from Margaret. Ward meeting moved to 4 p.m. due to media situation. They want to see how coverage develops before voting. The delay created an opportunity Aurora hadn't expected the chance to shape public understanding of her partnership with Evan before her board made their final decision. She looked at the gathering crowd outside, the families who'd driven from across the city to support the center, and the reporters who were documenting a story about innovation emerging from unexpected places. I think we need to go outside, Aurora said to Evan. If people are going to tell our story, we should make sure they get it right. The impromptu press conference that developed on the community center's front steps felt surreal to Aurora, who'd spent years carefully managing her public image through corporate communications departments. But standing beside Evan, while Isla demonstrated her prosthetics to fascinated reporters, she felt more authentic than she had during any staged corporate announcement. Mrs. Wyndham, is it true that you personally purchased a $40 million development project to save this community center? Asked a reporter from the city's largest television station. I purchased an opportunity to prove that profitable development can coexist with community services. Aurora replied, falling back on the language she'd rehearsed for the board meeting. The partnership we're announcing today between Wyndham Shipping and the center's engineering program has the potential to revolutionize affordable prosthetic technology. What followed was the most natural publicity Aurora had ever experienced. Instead of scripted talking points, she found herself explaining Evan's innovations with genuine enthusiasm, describing Isla's progress with authentic pride, and outlining their business partnership with the confidence of someone who'd done extensive homework. Evan proved to be a compelling interview subject, demonstrating prosthetic components while explaining engineering principles in language that made complex technology accessible to general audiences. His obvious expertise, combined with his humble presentation, created exactly the kind of authentic credibility that corporate communications consultants spent millions trying to manufacture. This is what innovation looks like when it's driven by necessity rather than profit margins, Evan told one reporter, holding up an ankle joint that looked like a work of art. Every component is designed around one question: how can we help this specific child move more naturally through the world? The coverage that emerged over the following hours exceeded Aurora's most optimistic expectations. Rather than focusing on corporate conflict or financial drama, reporters emphasized the human impact of technological innovation, the transformation of individual families, and the potential for wider applications of garage workshop engineering. By 3:30 p.m., Aurora's phone was buzzing with calls from board members who'd been watching the coverage and reconsidering their positions. The media attention had reframed their decision from financial risk management to market opportunity validation, exactly the shift Aurora had hoped to achieve. "The coverage is remarkable," Catherine Morrison admitted during a brief phone call. "You and Cole come across as genuine innovators rather than corporate do-gooders. That changes the optics significantly." As Aurora prepared to return to the boardroom for the rescheduled vote, she felt confident that she'd presented the strongest possible case for her vision. The media coverage had demonstrated public support. Evan's expertise had been validated by independent observers, and the business case for affordable prosthetic technology had been articulated in terms that emphasized opportunity rather than charity. "Whatever happens in there," Evan said, as Aurora prepared to leave the community center, "you've already transformed what's possible for these families. That's worth more than any corporate title." Aurora squeezed his hand briefly, a gesture that felt natural despite the professional boundaries they'd maintained throughout their partnership. "We're going to do this together, Evan. I can feel it." Walking back into Wyndham Shipping's headquarters, Aurora carried with her the confidence of someone who'd learned the difference between being powerful and being effective. Win or lose, she'd discovered something more valuable than corporate success: the satisfaction that came from building solutions rather than managing problems. 6 months after the board vote that had approved Aurora's partnership with Evan by a narrow margin of 4-3, the Riverside Adaptive Technology Center occupied a renovated warehouse that buzzed with the kind of purposeful activity Aurora had learned to recognize as innovation in progress. The space combined the intimacy of Evan's original workshop with the resources necessary to serve families from across the region, creating an environment where engineering sophistication coexisted with personal attention. Aurora walked through the main development area, noting details that still surprised her despite her daily involvement in the center's operations. Where she'd once expected sterile medical equipment, she found workstations that looked more like artist studios, each one customized for different types of adaptive technology development. The air carried familiar scents of metal shavings and coffee, but now they mixed with the sounds of children's laughter and the quiet concentration of engineers who'd learned to measure success in mobility rather than profit margins. The Prague facility wants to license the sensor technology for their pediatric program, Evan reported, approaching with a tablet displaying international inquiries that had become routine since their innovations began gaining recognition in medical journals. And the team in Kenya is reporting remarkable success with the lightweight materials we developed for tropical climates. Aurora smiled at the irony of Evan delivering business updates, with grease stains still visible on his hands from the morning's prosthetic fitting session. Their partnership had evolved into something neither of them could have predicted, a hybrid organization that functioned simultaneously as a research facility, manufacturing center, and community resource. "How is the new apprentice program developing?" Aurora asked, gesturing toward a corner where 3 recent engineering graduates worked alongside experienced technicians, learning Evan's methods through hands-on collaboration. "Better than I expected," Evan replied. "Turns out that people who choose to work here are naturally inclined toward the kind of patient, individualized approach that makes this work successful. We're not just teaching technical skills, we're selecting for values that align with putting children's needs first." The apprentice program represented Aurora's solution to the scalability challenge that had concerned the board during their partnership approval. Rather than expanding through traditional corporate hiring, they developed a training model that preserved the center's culture, while gradually increasing their capacity to serve more families. Isla appeared from the testing area, walking with the natural confidence of someone who'd forgotten that her mobility was technologically assisted rather than biologically natural. At 15, she'd grown into her role as the center's youngest consultant, working with new patients to explain not just how their prosthetics worked, but how adaptation felt from a user's perspective. "Mrs. Chun's daughter Emma is ready for dynamic testing," Isla announced, referring to the latest in a series of modifications they developed for a 7-year-old whose needs challenged conventional prosthetic design. "She wants to try jumping and running, not just walking." Aurora watched her daughter discuss technical specifications with the casual expertise of someone who'd grown up immersed in adaptive engineering. Isla's transformation from passive patient to active innovator represented everything Aurora had hoped their partnership could achieve, turning individual challenges into collaborative solutions that benefited entire communities. "How's Emma feeling about the modifications?" Aurora asked, remembering her own daughter's nervousness during early testing phases. "Excited but nervous," Isla replied with the empathy of someone who'd navigated similar emotions. "I told her that the first time feels weird, but after a few days, you forget you're wearing anything different. It just becomes part of how you move." Max, now 12 and Isla's frequent collaborator, joined their conversation carrying what looked like a miniature shock absorber designed for a prosthetic knee joint. His involvement in the center's work had evolved from childhood curiosity to genuine technical contribution, demonstrating an intuitive understanding of biomechanics that impressed visiting medical professionals. "Dad, the university research team wants to know if they can publish our joint stability data," Max said, offering the component for examination. "They think our approach to adaptive resistance could influence commercial prosthetic development." Aurora accepted the device, marveling at its sophisticated simplicity and remembering her first glimpse of Evan's innovations in the community center's crowded workshop. The technology had evolved significantly, but it retained the essential characteristics that made Evan's work special precision engineering, guided by deep understanding of individual human needs. "Publishing is fine," Evan said, as long as they acknowledged that the innovations came from listening to children rather than theoretical analysis. "Credit belongs to the kids who told us what wasn't working and helped us figure out how to fix it." The philosophy underlying Evan's response had become central to the center's culture and increasingly influential in broader conversations about medical device development. Their success had demonstrated that innovation driven by user feedback could produce superior results to research conducted in isolation from practical application. Aurora's phone buzzed with a text from her assistant. "Barcelona partnership contracts ready for signature." The European expansion is approved for next quarter." She smiled at how naturally international business development had integrated with prosthetic engineering, creating revenue streams that supported both the center's community mission and Wyndham Shipping's growth objectives. "Speaking of partnerships," Aurora said to Evan, "I have something to show you." She led him to her office, which occupied a corner of the warehouse that balanced executive functionality with the center's collaborative atmosphere. Instead of marble and mahogany, Aurora had chosen reclaimed wood and industrial lighting, creating a space that felt both professional and authentic. On her desk sat a bronze plaque that would soon be mounted in the center's main entrance. The inscription read, "Riverside Adaptive Technology Center, founded 2025, Aurora Wyndham and Evan Cole, co-directors, dedicated to proving that the greatest innovations come from love guided by expertise. I thought we should acknowledge what we've built together," Aurora said, watching Evan read the inscription with the careful attention he gave to technical specifications. "Co-directors," Evan repeated, his voice carrying surprise despite this months of equal partnership. "That's accurate, but it still feels strange to see it in bronze." Aurora understood his hesitation. Their collaboration had evolved organically, with responsibilities and recognition shared based on expertise rather than formal hierarchy. Making their partnership official felt both natural and revolutionary in a business world that typically valued credentials over capability. "You've earned it," Aurora said simply. "The innovations that built this place came from your workshop, your methods, your dedication to individual children. I just provided the resources to scale what you already proven worked." Their conversation was interrupted by sounds of celebration from the main workspace, where Emma Chun had apparently achieved her goal of running confidently on her new prosthetics. Aurora and Evan moved to the windows overlooking the testing area, watching as a 7-year-old girl demonstrated mobility that would have seemed impossible during Aurora's early visits to the original community center. "That never gets old," Evan said quietly, his voice carrying satisfaction that transcended professional achievement. Aurora nodded, understanding that they were witnessing something more valuable than business success or technical innovation. Emma's confidence, her family's relief, and the gathering crowd of children and staff celebrating together represented the human impact that made their work meaningful. As evening approached and families began the transition from therapy sessions to dinner routines, Aurora found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought her from corporate isolation to community leadership. The transformation hadn't been easy. Board meetings still challenged her patience. International partnerships required constant attention, and the balance between business sustainability and mission focus demanded daily navigation. But watching Isla work with younger children, seeing Evan's innovations reach families in 12 countries, and knowing that their partnership had demonstrated sustainable alternatives to traditional corporate philanthropy, Aurora felt the deep satisfaction that came from building something that mattered. "Ready to go home?" Evan asked, beginning the evening cleanup routine that had become familiar over months of shared work. Aurora looked around the center that had become her second home, noting details that represented both individual achievements and collective growth. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, children needing custom solutions, international partners requiring technical support, and the ongoing work of proving that business success and social impact could reinforce rather than compete with each other. "Home sounds perfect," Aurora replied, gathering her things while watching the evening sun cast long shadows across workbenches where miracles happened daily. As they walked toward the parking lot together, followed by Isla and Max discussing improvements to prosthetic sensor technology, Aurora realized that the greatest transformation hadn't been in her daughter's mobility, or even in her own understanding of meaningful work. It had been in her definition of family, expanded now to include partnerships built on mutual respect, shared values, and the recognition that some achievements required collaboration rather than competition. A riverside adaptive technology. Center stood behind them, its lights still glowing as evening shift volunteers continued the work of helping children move confidently through the world. For Aurora, it represented proof that wealth wisely used could create opportunities rather than merely accumulate advantages, and that the most satisfying investments paid dividends measured in children's laughter rather than quarterly reports. 6 months ago, she'd been a corporate executive managing decline. Tonight, she was co-director of an organization that was transforming both individual lives and industry standards. The change felt as natural as Isla's confident stride and as promising as the international partnerships that would extend their innovations to children who needed hope more than they needed explanations about why help wasn't available. Some stories ended with dramatic transformations, but Aurora had learned that the best ones continued with the quiet satisfaction of work that mattered, relationships that deepened with time, and the daily opportunity to choose building over buying, collaboration over control, and love over fear in all its forms.